Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first iteration of the Great Open Source Debate. My name is Yash, the host of this show for today, and also the Developer Relations Manager at Rocket.Chat. As the name suggests, this is going to be all about open source. With our awesome guest today, we'll be questioning some of the fundamental things around open source, some views. Some people have different views, and we'll be talking about that. We have collected different sorts of views from all over the world to actually talk about this. The aim is not to promote a specific mindset, but to actually have an open mind around the world of open source. We are not saying the open source world is good, bad, worthy, or not. We're not giving any opinions from our side. We are just having the aim to understand different perspectives for everyone present here, right? And not just us. It is basically you all, the awesome community that took time and joined us for this particular debate, as we are calling it, and taken time to join this live stream from all of us. We really value the love you have seen us all here, given us all over here. So to start off, let's do something interesting. Let's do something different. So let's throw in some emojis in the chat, please. Like, I would love to see some emojis in the chat. I want to see some emojis. I have one over here. I'll just open it up to see what's going on. And here's my favorite fire emoji. I always use this one. I tend to use this one a lot, I should say. So please open up your favorite emoji. I see rocket chat, rocket emojis. I can see laughing, love. Oh, a truck emoji as well. That's unique. Okay. Oh no. The like closing your eyes monkey emoji. Oh no, there are a lot of emojis out there. I just love that. So tell us, like, where are you joining from? Like, wherever in the world are you joining us? Let us know first of all. That I want to see the different people all over the world over here. I want to experience what are the different people are coming over here. Brazil for sure, a lot of people are joining. Estonia, that's good. Germany, Albania, Bhubaneswar, India as well. Oh, that's awesome. Finland. Oh, Jupiter. Nice, Devdut, that you're over here. Ukraine, India, Romania, Italy. Oh, man, so many places. I want to visit them all, to be very honest. And that's why I joined the DevRel job as well at Rocket Chat. And Singapore, Mexico. Wow, there are so many places. I see another one from India over here. Awesome. Thanks a lot for joining and being so active on the chat today. So before we get started, let's meet our guests for today. We have Arvind from Elastic, Karan from GitHub, Mike from Glue. Let's have let's have them go alphabetically. What you say? Would you like to introduce yourself, Arvind, first?
Oh yeah. First of all, it sounds really. I mean, it's really crazy that I'm participating in this panel. I'm always like really interested to talk about open source. And then thanks Yash and Rocket Chat and everyone for giving the opportunity. That being said, I'm Arvind. I work as a developer advocate at Elastic. Do developery things. Like talk to the community, like share the feedback back to the product team. So that's what I do at work, but I'm at the core of what I do. Like it's more of open source, and I love interacting with communities again and again. So yeah, I hope that I'm gonna have a nice time today. Yeah.
Awesome. Definitely, we are going to have a last nice time with you, Arvind. Okay, Karan, would you like to go next, please?
Hey everyone, thanks for joining in today, and thanks Rocket Chat for having me here. I'm Karan, and I'm a senior developer relations manager here at GitHub. So I work very closely with the open source ecosystem, and also, of course, the developer community in all of the things that's awesome with open source and GitHub. So really, really excited to be here along with Arvind and Mike to discuss on a whole lot of things related to open source. It's really exciting what's coming up, and would love to have a discussion with all of you as well joining in.
Awesome. And finally, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Yash, for arranging this, and thanks to Rocket Chat for hosting it and promoting it. And as some of you might know, I'm Mike Schwartz. I'm the founder and CEO of Glue. I'm also the host of a podcast called Open Source Underdogs, which I'm probably going to mention a few times in this talk, and I put the link in the chat already at the very top. And so I guess, as the business leader of Glue, it's my job to figure out how does open source fit within the business model of the company, and how does it help us? And so that was one of the goals of the podcast, to figure that out. And so over the last couple of years, I think I have somewhat more nuanced view of like how and when you should use open source. So I'm looking forward to the talk today.
Awesome. So glad to have you all over here. So glad you accepted our invitation to come over here. So, coming to our show today, I'll quickly make everyone aware about the rules a bit. Okay. So, although we are calling this a debate, this is just meant to be a fun and interesting discussion on different opinions rather than anything that might be very harsh for anyone. So please be mindful of the code of conduct in the chat, please. I really value you all supporting us in this. For the format, we have collected some interesting statements or opinions what people have about open source and which will be showing up on the screen. We'll give a chance to all our speakers to agree or disagree, and we'll have definitely the line mentioned over here. And there will be a discussion back and forth until we have a conclusion. For this platform, if you all can see, you are already talking in the chat. That's awesome. You have questions and polls over here as well, right? And we are going to display all the statements as polls so that we have a general idea of what the community thinks about a particular statement. We'll talk about that as well. And questions for sure. If you have any questions about anything, about any statement, about any single thing, just mention it. We have our awesome team working over here in the background, helping you all with anything and everything. We already have a poll over there. If you are interested, just write yes or no, and we'll contact you accordingly. And we'll take up some questions on the chat, like on the chat and questions over here with our speakers as well. So now, just one more thing. Let me introduce you something more interesting for all of you over here. We have a surprise competition that's going on. You heard me. I have some really interesting Rocket Chat mugs, something I use every single day. And we'll be offering this to the best questions, the best opinions we get on the chat. And there are multiple to be offered. So don't worry about it. We'll contact you accordingly. And just write your questions, arguments for each of the topics we are discussing over here. Make sure to ask all the things to our speakers. You'll get the best chance to do it. And the best ones will get the marks. So that was a lot of me talking. So let's get this started. Perfect. I did not have any intro, so I thought this might be a good idea to do.
Hey,
Cool.
yes, you should have told me this before. I would have had my slate also ready.
Oh, that's awesome. Perfect. So, coming to the first statement over here, contribution in open source is not for junior developers. So, by junior developers, I mean students and people who are inexperienced in the world of open source. So, going again alphabetically, Arvind, do you agree or disagree?
I would say, like, I would disagree with this statement. Like, open source is for everyone. I would just say it's for everyone. It's not just limited to any particular set of people. Yeah.
Okay, we'll get more opinions later. Karan, do you agree or disagree?
I disagree to this.
And Mike?
Well, everyone has to start somewhere, right? So I think that, yeah, you definitely want people to contribute over the whole arc of their career. And
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe major contributions to the code that change a lot of stuff aren't going to go in without a lot of peer review, right, on the PR.
Okay.
But yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. If you see something you can fix, go for it and submit it, and
Okay.
people will review
Okay.
it. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I got initial response from everyone over here as well. So it looks like all our speakers are agreeing. So definitely the host has to disagree a bit over here. So my question currently directly goes towards Hacktoberfest that is going on over here as well, right? So you all agree that people should get a chance. You all have said something around it. Like you all will make more statements around it. But think about the nightmares for the maintainers. Think about what they go through around people who have different ways of contributing into open source, which might not be exactly inclined to make the project go forward and things like that. So like this is my view, initial view over here. And Arvind, would you like to like expand on your view, and why should you think people should actually allow junior developers to go forward?
See, I wouldn't, to start with, I wouldn't put or label the kind of labels that we attach to people is very important sometimes. Like, and I wouldn't attach anybody a label like you are junior or you're senior. A developer is a developer, and I have met a lot of people who are pretty much senior and they don't know how to raise a PR. And it's not bad even, like, probably they have worked all the time with SVN, and Git is not something that they might be, or GitHub in general. So it's a learning curve. And then when it comes to the specifically the point you made about Hacktoberfest or any hackathon where it is driven by swag or anything, or it is driven for in a different reason, not just swag for but anything else, like today it so happened that open source is kind of like hey, I have contributed and it's a crazy thing, and then I have got my name on the project, in the release notes, and that's good in a way. And I also contributed. I made a doc change, and which is very minimal, or like you changed a comma or you added an apostrophe, and then you said like your name still kind of comes into the contribution. So I don't think all of that sort of thing. It should not be a token. But it is something that you should feel proud as well as a developer. So you should give some knowledge, or you should guide them to make them better, rather than just banning them out of like, hey, I don't encourage you. But I do agree to the point that maintainers it takes a lot of toll on their mental health as well. Like, people posting all the PRs. I do agree to that. But that being said, I fundamentally feel there is a lot of education to do, and it's a community thing. It's our job to do that.
Definitely. Karan, would you like to take on your point, please?
Yeah, I think I agree to a lot of the things that Arvind mentioned. You can't really attach a tag. For me, what I always like to think of it is that the result of a contribution to open source should be judged by the happiness it delivers, and not by whether it's a merge PR or whether it's not, etc. Because sometimes what happens is that discussions drive ideas, which drive decisions. So even that discussion could be an indirect contribution that you are doing for that project or that community, etc. And often, a lot of these ideas that you get, or a lot of these discussions that could happen, always come from various different places. So it's something that comes like collectively together to contribute to open source. Now, and if you take out even that whole aspect of developer or a junior developer, who did the logo for a project, who did the spell check for a documentation, who did the UI design for it, who is actually talking to all of these people, right? So each and everything is a contribution, without which we might not be actually able to even identify or relate to that project. So it's kind of important to look at every aspect of what goes into that project, and what you can contribute to, and across the whole spectrum as well.
Awesome. Those were really great by Karan. Mike, would you like to expand on your one, please?
So I think it's sort of a question about project governance, because
Mhm.
projects will have a natural life cycle. When they start out, they'll be more informal, and as the projects mature, there's more CI/CD and other formal governance sort of put on the project. And so to a certain extent, yeah, no, it is a lot of work to maintain these things, and and the developers should figure out what is the right process for them based upon where the project is in the life cycle and what's the governance of the project. And but as long as it aligns with sort of like the normal process, like I agree with Arvin that it doesn't matter what the person's title is. It's irrelevant. So is it a good PR
Right.
or not?
Definitely. Now, I'll try to drive this thing a bit over here. So I'll take few of the points you all mentioned. Irvin, you mentioned very properly that someone should not have like proper hats on top of anyone. You are junior, you are senior, or anything. Karan, you mentioned it should be done for happiness, and a lot of projects have different things, not just the code part, the UI UX, the logo part, and everything. And Mike, you mentioned about the automated processes and all things that are in place to actually guide this governance inside of open source. Now, talking about the first things first, like talking about putting on different hats. Now, if we do some kind of structuring in the community when it contributes, it definitely helps us to drive contributions, right? So we try to give them some kind of an incentive, generally what is seen in open source, to actually contribute a bit to get something over there. And those motivations, similar to what Hacktoberfest does, is giving some kind of recognition for it, giving some kind of swags for it. But do you feel these motivations do actually drive the open source world forward?
I would like to go first and mention something that occurred to my mind, and it is very much there in, if you are follower of economics, and then this point would come up because it's about incentives and putting up right incentives, and there is something called misaligned incentives. Sometimes it so could really happen that your incentive, your intention is right, but the incentive that you are, or the process that you have designed, might cause havoc or problems in a way that you generate more of it, but you don't want that to happen, but it did happen, and the incentives are misaligned, so people abuse that. And I would think that that is the way, and you should be able to do second order thinking sometimes to
Mhm.
kind of like improve the process that you have. And that puts up the, again, coming to forward, and thinking about how do I talk to people, how do I put these which contribution should I be okay with, how do I guide people, should I be putting a funnel or a process, so all of this comes up again. So yeah.
Right, definitely, and definitely those misguided like incentives like the major reason. So, what do you think can be a right incentive for these people to actually contribute in the right sense?
So
Can I jump in here for a sec?
Yeah, definitely.
I think it's hard to generalize about open source because, I always tell people there's three, broad categories of open source projects: a volunteer project, where there's something either you're doing or a group of people or companies are doing for love. And then there's what I call a corporate open source project, where, some corporation decides they're going to open source something they're doing to like lower the costs and build a community. And then there's pure play open source, where there's some type of business model behind a company that's taking the open source and making a product and making a business out of it. And it's hard to generalize about how do you incentivize community. And there's also such a broad range of different projects. So an enterprise security product like Glue maybe has a smaller community of very specialized experts who's interested in it, but who really need something that's open source. Whereas you could have a database where there's a very diverse global community that's contributing. So the communities themselves can vary, and it's just hard to say what's a right way to encourage developer contribution and incentivize that. The best way is to pay them a fair wage. And actually, most open source is actually done, or you know, I, let's say most of the open source projects we use every day are developed and written by people who are paid to do it. So it's not like, um, anyway, that's my thought. So.
Yeah,
That's a really
that's
good point. Yeah, Karan, please.
that's a good thing as well. In fact, Arvind gave a analogy to economics. I want to give an analogy to what we come across in software itself, right? So many of us might know the paradigm of BDD, behavior driven development. So you define what's the behavior for the code that you want, and you write tests based on that behavior, and then you go and you write the actual code, right? So very similar, you need to think about, okay, what is the behavior that you want to drive from your contributors, right? So
Mhm.
the first thing that will come to our mind, of course, is like, I want code. Like, yeah, of course you might want, but you need to get into more detail that, okay, what is it that you actually want them to do? Do you want them to, write, an entire module? Do you want to write them, just some pieces of it, etc. Right? So that's why, you need to think about how you are, what is the kind of behavior that you want to drive, and then kind of incentivize it, very much according to it. And that's one of the reasons why, I think now, or even in the past, many of the projects that actually get really good contributions are those which have, these kind of well defined pieces. And incentives, I totally agree with Mike. Monetary incentives are always helpful, and that's something that you folks would see on GitHub sponsors as well, wherein you can actually go and support the projects that you are dependent on for your own projects, and kind of encourage them to just grow that project and that ecosystem and that community.
Great. So I totally agree to your points over here. One thing we mentioned that we definitely need some kind of a right incentive, right? And we talked about giving some kind of a monetary incentives, and we talked about GitHub sponsors as well. So GitHub sponsors is something that is for the maintainers, right? For that project, and they definitely need some kind of a help to get it supported. But if we talk about the junior folks, like who are just getting into the world of open source, like they are the people who might be not even like interviewing in a place, they are not experienced in that way, right? Every company has some kind of a threshold to get people working on their project. So do you think there should be some kind of a threshold every project should have to get people working on their project?
GitHub's like, I always joke about it. It's like a social network where you check in code. Um, and it's a great like sort of level playing field, because you can see people's history, and sometimes even for private projects, that they personal projects are quantifiable. Um, and so there are developers out there who have been working for private companies for years who don't have a lot checked into GitHub. So there's no like silver bullet here, but it is useful for new developers because I think all software development shops are looking for quantifiable evidence that you know what you're doing, and nothing's better than looking at your GitHub repositories and your check-ins and your PRs. So I think it's ultimately fantastic. Like, there's never been a better day to be a developer in terms of like flexibility of where you can work and um, who you can work with. So.
Awesome. And definitely that makes a lot of sense in what you said just now in terms of like what we see in the real world open source projects right now as well. Coming to that, like we are actually on time. So I just wanted to take some audience questions as well. They are really good questions like and statements that have been made. So first of all, the one statement was made, how do you define an open source project? How do you make sure, like, how do I define an open source project? Anyone of you would like to take that up?
Maybe Karan. He's doing everything probably. He's doing the same thing every day.
Yeah. So, there are there are various definitions, honestly speaking, of what open source really means. But I'm going to give something that's very generalized and has an overarching meaning and understanding. So basically, any open source project um, needs to be, first of all, public, right? So that's one criteria. And second is that whatever you are releasing as open source should have a defined license, or licenses, at the case maybe, which kind of clearly lays out what you can or what you cannot do with that specific project. And these are essentially just the two key things. If you were to look at it in a very overarching manner in terms of what exactly it is. That's very much about it. So the license can be as granular as you like. What it can do. There are many big projects which have like multiple licenses, and everything else is on is to kind of just help kind of move the project along.
Awesome, definitely. And coming to that particular thing as well, one of our like viewers think like this question was poorly formed. Sorry for that. That you feel like that. The contribution to open source isn't just about junior developers. In fact, in their thinking, forced contributions were for stallman level devs. So, what do you think about that?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, please.
Yeah.
Okay. So contributing to open source isn't just for junior developers.
Uh-huh.
In fact, in their thinking, forced contributions were for stallman level developers.
Forced contributions? You mean so forcing people to make their contributions public?
Forced, like free and open source. Open source
Oh,
contributions were
FOSS.
for
Okay.
stallman level developers.
Oh, you know, well, let me just take a stab at this one. Sorry, Arvind, but to jump in, but um, so I think it's really hard to make these generalizations about open source because there's so many different types of open source projects. Um, and I don't know. I think that we need to when we're talking about open source, say like what type of project and what is their goal for that.
Right. It depends on the project and what is their goal. So definitely, some kind be a really high level projects that require high level contributions, and definitely some require smaller level contributions. So in essence, we are coming to a conclusion to this point. If I might add, and if you want to add something, I would love to you all to add something. Open source is definitely for everyone. Everyone needs to have a plain field where they can actually play around and see what's going on in the world. But definitely when it comes to incentives, it has to be aligned in a proper sense about what they want to achieve and what the projects want to achieve. There has to be some kind of a governance, some kind of tools and automation set around what a particular project wants, and it's up to the maintainers to set that, and not just a generalization of this will work, right?
Sounds
Anything
good
you
to
want
me.
to add? Okay, perfect. So we have a conclusion to the first statement. Congratulations, everyone. Let's move on to the second one. One should never try to make money with open source. I guess that's like a direct hit on Rocket Chat as well. So what's your state? Agree or disagree, Arvind?
So I would disagree again.
Okay.
I have strong
Okay.
feelings about it.
Cool. Karan?
I would also disagree to this.
Okay. And Mike?
Well, so there's 51 podcasts or so I've recorded the people who disagree from companies, large open source companies. I think it's the question is like, does open sourcing the software align with a business goal? And if so, you should consider it, and that could be a part of the business model. Um, but I don't think that actually, what company has open source not been a part of that even exists today? Like, so I think a lot of people are they sold Instagram for a lot. I hear they use a lot of open source libraries in that. So um, I don't think I think these are, what's the word? Mutually exclusive, or um,
Mhm.
they're totally different.
Right.
Is considerations. Yeah.
So it's pretty open ended. We can actually think about like projects that have been owned by big corporations that are started by smaller, like totally junior developers, as we were saying earlier, or like anyone in essence, right? So for one point, like you had like a sub question added to it, like for somebody it like is fine, some for someone else it might not be fine. How do you think about the generalized question about this, Mike?
Well, another way to look at this is maybe to say um, that there need to be clear boundaries between what's open source and what's not. Like what's open source and what's commercial. Because
Mm,
while there's a good case for for open source development methodology, there's a good
Hmm.
case for the distribution model of open source, getting your software into more people's hands.
Right.
There's for us at Glue, a big part of it is about trust. Nothing builds trust like source code. Um,
Hmm.
so on the other hand, we have a commercial side of the business that says we're giving you a lot for free, and here are the things that we're selling. We can build some extra tools that make deployment and easier or provide enterprise features that we don't see as core, and that's
Hmm.
monetizing. So I think one of the keys is when you're thinking about money and open source is um, to, if you're going to use open source as part of your business model, go in with a clear idea about the monetization strategy and make those
Hmm.
boundaries clear so the community understands. And actually, a good business model supporting an open source pays for a lot of developers.
Hmm.
So having a way to monetize the right interested parties prevents a tragedy of the commons.
Right.
So anyway.
So, in a sense, I'll definitely get you over here that you kind of disagree, but you are on the fence about what kind of incentives might drive it, right? Again, right? So, like now coming back to the statements over here, Arvind, like you mentioned, you disagree to this particular point. Like, what made you disagree?
See, I have a philosophy in how I would think about anything and everything in general. So it's like a thin line to balance, right? You are having a string, and then like you have to walk on that path, and then you have to balance it very nicely, and it should also not look bad, and you should not be really bad about doing what you're trying to do. So you should not overdo anything when it comes to open source. Again, like go out for money, like do a lot of things which are like anti-ethical. I mean, it's not really ethical to do some things, but then at the same point of time, it's not bad to talk about open source and just making money for it. Like I've seen a lot of developers put in a lot of after work hours, and then still they have a lot of problems, like they do, and many organizations use that, and then still the person's effort is not recognized. I've known a lot of people who have done crazy projects, simple libraries, but are used in every mobile phone, and then the person is single and like he wouldn't get paid. So there are many use cases like this. It's not bad if someone is like not being able to make money, or like people should think of monetization strategy. Actually, I wrote a blog about it, about open source and sustainability. I'll paste it here. But then it's very important to think about, like what Mike said, is think about a monetization or your business model, or think about how you want to go and take this approach, and clearly communicating that idea with your community or the user base that you are talking about again and again is very important, especially when you are publicly stating, putting up the source code.
Right. Right. So basically, your point is very similar to what Mike said in terms like there should be a perfect business strategy, a monetization strategy to move forward. And it is not totally good for anybody to do everything for free because of their personal lives as well. Coming to Karan, like what made you disagree to this point?
See, it's kind of course, very similar to what Mike and Arvind said.
Hmm.
But one of the things that I really want to add is that it helps, just keep the ecosystem going, right? So the reason why more and more people are kind of coming back and contribute to open source is because they kind of believe in the ecosystem as a whole. That this is gonna help me learn, this is gonna help me kind of grow as a developer, etc., right? So if you kind of connect those dots everywhere, it comes back to the thing that this ecosystem is valuable and this is something that's going to help me, right?
Hmm.
One of the things also that is, if you look at organizations, it is just an incentive for them also to kind of keep giving back, right?
Hmm.
Now, if you look at a business and an entity, and they are actually directly or indirectly, having a monetization strategy around their project, most often they also come back and give back a lot more uh, to open source ecosystem itself, right? So we kind of hear from various different organizations where, and in fact, it's almost a norm at very many different organizations these days, where the engineers, if they're working on a specific project, they try to come back and contribute back that to upstream as well, right? And help fix things if they're working
Mhm.
on specific things, right? So that incentive will actually be driven because there's some monetization behind the person who is working over there for open source. So
Right.
it's kind of important to think about that chain of incentives as well.
Right. And it very well ties on to the things we have discussed in the previous question as well. And if I see the community responding to it, like in the last question, they had a very staggeringly different opinion because 96% of the people disagree that one should never try to make money with open source. On the other hand, 83%, that's like significantly lower, thought about the junior developer like opinion as well. So like disagreed with that opinion. So now I'm coming to a few other points on this aspect. So definitely one aspect is the business model. And I feel sometimes when there's a business model, it might kill this essence of open source in a particular project. There might be product development driven towards enterprise. There might be product development driven towards the customer's need rather than the community's need, right? There can be a case for that. And do you think, like we discussed about GitHub sponsors earlier, something like that should be the way to go and the most fundamental way to go rather than making like a total strategy around how you need to host this business?
So I'll just take a stab at it. So the word that I would use is, and I'm glad that Arvind brought that up previously, is sustainability, you know, and not necessarily monetization or a business, etc. There are a lot of open source projects, which are actually sustaining without monetary support, or without a monetary incentive, because they're able to sustain and there is support coming in, through various other forms, right? So maybe they are having a whole lot of infrastructure requirements which someone is supporting, or maybe they have they're kind of working towards the side and their employer itself is actually supporting them, etc. And together they're kind of able to sustain it, right? But many of the projects actually might not have really that support or that privilege to sustain without a monetary support, right? So that's when you kind of have to start thinking about how do you sustain yourself, right? And it could be multiple different ways. If I have to really very 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 starkly call out the difference, right? Very starkly call out the difference. It could be that if I as a person have to sustain, am I going to think about how do I keep earning and making money, or will I be thinking about how can I sustain myself on donations and charity, right? So the similar thing extends because it is people
Right.
who are involved, and it is about the sustainability of not just the project but also the people who are behind it. That's concerned.
Right, definitely. Mike, would you like to add something over here because you mentioned very clearly about the business things as well?
Well, actually, I put in the chat that there was an episode about in the podcast about tide lift. And so it's true that not every project has a monetization strategy. So every business needs to have a monetization strategy, but there are lots of projects that aren't businesses. As I mentioned earlier, some of them are just volunteers projects, where you are interested in something, or some interested community gets together. Um, and there's so the question, but some of those downstream projects produce very important libraries. There was a case about somebody who removed their string processing JavaScript libraries from npm, and it caused a lot of like havoc. Um, and so sometimes we do forget about some of these downstream projects that actually are critical to the infrastructure. And some of them are hard to monetize. And Tidelift is trying to figure out a way that we can provide distributions of open source that companies can consume, because companies can't just send open source developers money. They need to buy something. And so Tidelift is trying to make a distribution where we can account for these downstream libraries and build a model for them. Because I do think yeah, so that we need alternate monetization strategies for some of these open source projects, which are super important. Um, but I guess I am plagued by seeing this as a very nuanced question, and there's just like I'm going to end every question and say, don't don't listen to any of this and figure out your own project.
Definitely. Arvind, you were saying something, I guess?
So I was saying that that's exactly what I mentioned in my blog. Like, you have to figure out, and then I want to also tell to people that we have to give that gap, or we have to let the people or the person who is maintaining this project, either the maintainers or the group of people who have started, or a single person, give that flexibility to change their mindset, think about it, and also, like, redraw their plans about monetizing, because we are not the person who have started the project, and they have just probably did it on a Saturday night or like a Friday night, and then it blew up, and like after a year it became a big project, and
Mhm.
then they never thought of monetization, but it is demanding more time and they can't go back on their thing. So there are a lot of nuances and then sometimes we
Mhm.
think like, oh, it's free and it's not free, and so yeah.
Right. Definitely. And the community has some very, very good questions over here. And I just want to take them all, but I don't know if I would be able to. We are almost on time for this question. So, the one I like is, do you think that open source projects make it possible to earn a living from having a deep knowledge of just one or a small set of open source projects only? Just one or only a small set of open source projects knowledge only?
I would let why I'm jumping, because I have an example to tell and quickly tell and finish, so that like Mike and Karan can probably share more deep thoughts on it. So I know a person or a specific instance of one person in like living in US, and where he made a project specifically used by a very big mega corp, and then eventually they didn't hire any, because he don't want to work with her anyone, and eventually they funded that project so much, so he's sustainable, and like he's continuing to patch up that project, even though it's not so like flashy, or like you had a lot of features, but then that's an interesting story that I've heard, and I think this is the probably the stories from Apple, and Apple funding a specific open source project, and the library I think is Neti. So there are many such cases I have heard, and I think it makes an interesting case to go out and do an open source project and earn a living.
Yeah, definitely. And the first thing I can think about is like small set of open source project, maybe Kubernetes, right? If you just know Kubernetes, it can like be able to possible earn a living over it. I can think about that. Anyone else wants to add anything on this?
So um, uh, okay, I lost my train of thought. Sorry, thinking about Kubernetes. Arvin, what were you saying again? Just give me the 2-second recap.
Like,
Um,
is it possible to make like earn a living just by knowing like a small set or a single open source project only?
Yeah, oh, okay. I'm sorry, I got it back. I was going to say, one, um, you could apply to a company that makes open source software. Like Elastic is hiring, I think. Send your or every good open source company out there. So if you want to make a living doing open source, work for an open source company. Um, Two, Apple, Google, well, we should put Apple at the bottom, but let's say Google, Facebook, Microsoft, IBM, Oracle, even Apple have they're the top contributors to open source. So if you want to work on open source, maybe work for one of those guys. They pay pretty well. Um,
Mhm.
and then third, I would say if you haven't, yes, there are communities around open source that's very valuable. There's a number of studies that show that open source skills is really valuable in the market today, and lots of companies need them. So I think, yeah, there's thousands probably of like open source platforms where if you become an expert in that, especially 3 years plus 10,000 hours, something like that, you can get a job probably. And then finally, I would say, should you try and make money off your open source project? Probably not. As somebody
Mhm.
who started an open source company, I would say listen to those 55 episodes on the podcast before you make that terrible decision to do it. And unless it's a really good case. Maybe keep it. I would say by default, keep your commercial your software licensed commercially, and only make it open source if there's a good reason.
Right. That was really good point. Uh, so I guess we are on a conclusion of this one as well. There are multiple ways to make money with open source, and actually, the 96% of our community agrees with that. One should make money with open source. It's not like it should be totally excluded. And a very good point Aaron mentioned over here as well, that not every project needs to be monetized, but there should be developers that can afford to spend time on something that is definitely important, which ties on to the sustainability part that Arvind mentioned as well, and the business strategy part what Mike and Karan mentioned about. So it's tying into a lot of different things. So let's move on to the next one, and that is where even I am on the fence about. Open source is just focused on creating alternatives to closed source projects and not making something extraordinary. So, Arvind, what do you think? Agree or disagree?
No, I would disagree. Like, it's not about this, that.
Okay. Karan?
I also disagree.
Okay. And Mike?
Well, every cliche has its basis in truth. And so certainly, I think when a new need arises in the market, sometimes commercial companies are first to put the funding to provide that need. And so maybe this is just a symptom of the way that markets evolve, which is that open source, especially around infrastructure projects, tends to actually be slower. It's you can actually write if you just tell like 10 developers to write something, you can write it faster than if you try and coalesce a community of interested parties and get them to agree on a governance model. And so it's a little bit of herding cats in open source. So yeah,
Mhm,
commercial companies are going to be faster a lot of times. I would
mhm,
also disagree because I would say that sometimes we get incredible innovation from open source that just like no commercial company saw this one coming. There's been a lot of
mhm,
stuff happening at the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, a lot of
mhm,
incubator projects that are pretty mind-boggling. I don't remember any open source sysdig. I
mhm,
mean, any commercial sysdig looking at kernel information and making information out of that, looking at kernel data and making information. So it's not a rule, but it does happen. I mean, to say that it never happens wouldn't be accurate either, because it does happen too.
mhm. Right, definitely. And there's a very funny comment in the chat as well. Closed source is focused on creating alternative to open source, and that's pretty much a lot of people think about as well. But I want to ask one question. You mentioned about CNCF, for example, right? And CNCF was formed when Google kind of gave away it to be owned by the community in one sense. So it was kind of closed source initially, to be very honest. And like generally, what do you think? Like, can you all think about more like examples of like open source projects that are truly open source, like truly innovative and started in a different essence only?
I want to jump in with something over here. A thought is that um, a lot of the things that and the reason why I mentioned I disagree over here is that if you just look at all of the layers of your software where you would be writing code, right? Maybe a lot of them are thinking about the application level, that okay, this is the final product which is closed source, and then here is something that's an open source alternative. But go way down that layers, and you will see that fundamentally a lot of the closed source products or platforms or whatever it is that are there could actually be written using open source projects itself. And that I would definitely call as extraordinary, because it's not something that is having and built an entire application that's user facing, but it's enabling so many other millions of other projects to build on top of it and do a whole lot more of other stuff. So if you look at all of those layers that leads up to building your complete software, be it your databases, be it your network, be it your just the individual languages itself, or be it the frameworks or whatever it is, right? So all of these individual components are coming together to create the products, and those final products themselves are also, you know, can be open source or closed source, etc. um, and
Mhm.
and of course, in each of these which I mentioned, again, there are a whole lot of, examples itself. Pick any language, or pick any framework, or pick any of the database or so, right? So those could be some of the examples.
Great, definitely. Arvind and Mike, would you like to add on it?
Yeah, I would agree to what also Mike said, because he said that it's not completely like, it's not completely true in a way that it so never happened that people created open source from closed source ideas. It's not exactly like that. But I would disagree to the second part. Like, open source is not actually making something extraordinary. It is making something extraordinary, and that's why major like cloud companies or mega corps are behind open source, just because like it gives you that added edge over getting many developers using that software, contributing to it, or doing different sort of things. My thought when it comes to creating alternatives or in general, like from what Karan has said, say I've heard, I remember this line from Bill Gates in some documentary I've seen. He says in that line is open source, or like the software in general, is abstraction of many things that has layered one over other. And in that part, for example, there are many crucial things. Say, for example, all our mobile phones or even our laptops or everything contains a core library called OpenSSL, which helps us connect,
Mhm.
which exchange certificates to make trust. And OpenSSL is so core today. If there is a vulnerability in open source, I mean OpenSSL, and everyone is trying to update their library, right? And it sounds so amazing to me that it powers a lot. Similarly, like I meant to say, that there is a lot of open source innovation. There's a lot of projects that are now, like you see, parallelly called as open source alternatives. I wrote a blog about it again, about how the era is changing, and people are creating SaaS open source alternatives, which is cool as well. Yeah.
Right, definitely. I guess you were saying something, Mike. I interrupted you.
Um, yeah, well, no, I like what like Karan was saying about how I think that we have a slightly like it may be a simplified view of how of applications, and it's sometimes I watch these spy movies and there'll be a scene where like the hacker has to break into the system, and the hacker's like, wait, give me another 25 seconds and I'll be in. I need to get into I'm almost in the mainframe or something, and I'm like, those people just don't understand like what it actually takes. And I think that what Karan was saying is that like if you look at modern software development, um, it really there's a lot of important contributors along the whole stack, not just the part that you
Yes.
see. And
Mhm.
so it open source really is a collaborative community of these people
Mhm.
working together. And well. Um, Yeah, so I guess if the original, there's a pejorative connotation that open source is copying commercial stuff. Um,
Mhm.
but I don't think that that's actually accurate. I think the question is when does it make sense to use open source as a better and more improved development methodology? Like when can you
Right.
write actually better software in an open
Mhm.
source community than you can write by having one company sort of top-down control all of the process? And so we have seen that sometimes, like certainly not to pick on a couple, but certainly there have been a lot of Microsoft bugs that have forced companies to have to push out emergency updates over, immediately. And there's been a lot of Cisco router bugs. Those are both commercial top-down quality control processes that even failed. Um,
Mhm.
so I think we're not going to see perfection, but the question is where do you have bugs fixed faster through a more or less transparent mechanism, um, and which development methodology leads to more innovation or more diversity. And so there are some very good cases or more trust. So I think the question is not like when is open source copying commercial, but
Mhm.
um, when is a certain type of software better written by a community?
Right, makes sense. And definitely, like when the code is open to a lot of people, it is easy to actually find bugs in a lot of sense. I'm kind of killing the vibe of the next question, I should say, but you mentioned a lot of things to actually preface this initially. And as I see, the community believes in this as well right now. And I was trying to figure out how to counter this one, but I could not, because I myself think like they are different different projects like that definitely take the leap forward of what the closed source is doing currently. I can have a lot of examples put in mind over here, but since we are all on the same page, I would like to move to the next question, since we don't have much time remaining for this particular debate. So moving ahead, we talked about open source, the code is open. You talked about security bugs, Mike, just now, in closed source projects as well. But since the code is open, don't you think it is exploiting, like it is leading to a lot of people who can actually exploit things? So definitely I'm on the fence as always. And what do you think, Arun? Would you like to agree or disagree on this particular point?
I would disagree because, like, uh, I mean, okay, I'll share my opinion later, but this is something that I've been there and worked on it, something on both sides, and then I know why open source products are more secure or like better when it compares to like closed source or any other like approach.
Right, Karan.
I also would disagree, and in fact, I was having a very similar conversation with one of the maintainers of the larger projects recently, and I can share some thoughts.
Okay, and Mike.
Um, well, I guess I'll say I disagree, but for the license is not necessarily related to the quality of the code in the development process. So you could have very insecure open source code, or you could have very insecure commercial code, and the other way around. So I think those two things aren't really related. I do
Right.
think, but if we're talking about the development process and not the license, not to hassle you, um, then I do think more transparency in the development process, especially today, given that we're delivering static containers that can be scanned, and that you're not just deploying your commercial software, you're deploying it on top of a stack of open source normally, Linux or whatever.
Mhm.
So I think that transparency and the tools that open source today, if they're vendors showing you the code in the process, it's probably going to be better than what they're not showing you.
Right. So definitely all of you actually disagree to this particular thing as I'm saying. So I will add a few points, something we had defined earlier as well, like in open source businesses, having a sustainable business model and everything. We were talking about licenses. We were talking about how security measures of closed source project are also different. We did not talk about a lot about plagiarism inside of open source as well, and a lot of things I guess can be connected here. If you have like a business model around an open source project, again your project can be plagiarized. For not security, it's not just about just code security or like platform security. I'm saying about your code can be plagiarized because it's open. Your like vulnerabilities are definitely exposed. For example, if you think about Rocket.Chat, for example, over here, I'll try to just sneak in a bit. If you build something on an apps engine, there might be a possibility you can do something to interfere with the chat system as well, right? And there might be some possibility that you can find something as a bug over there. So for someone who has a decent motive, they might just report it to us in issues, but someone who does not have a decent motive might try to sneak in a bit, right? And this makes it a bit easier because closed source projects have their bug bounty programs because they can afford it. A smaller open source project cannot afford it in that sense. So, like, I added a few points just to drive this discussion forward. I should like have taken it slowly, but I'm trying to take it like fast because of the time limit. So, what do you all think about the different points? Like, Karan, you had something in mind earlier, so I want you to take that forward, and then we can discuss about all those points as well.
So firstly, I want to keep I want to keep the the plagiarism side, different, because that's a whole discussion by itself. And if you're talking of security in terms of is the is the code, or is the project actually secure and good enough, in that case, what I would say is that it has a whole lot of advantages for sure, because of just a whole lot of eyes that go into it. And the 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 nuance over here is that a whole lot of open source projects and products, even though they are open source, um, they kind of work on some of the security aspects of the open source project and products itself a bit in private. And when I say private, it could be within the maintainers or a certain set of contributors, right? Because think of it almost like saying that if you were to put it out there in the open, that hey, here is my project, here is my vulnerability, go ahead and then do whatever you want, right? So that is not what you would do even in real life, like here is my door, here is my key, and go ahead and then try it out, right? So that's why a lot of the open source projects take a slightly different approach for kind of securing it. They kind of do whatever is required when it's reported, like a bug bounty, when you say it or someone else notices it, make it secure, so that while they're working on it and there is a vulnerability that's kind of existing, attackers don't make use of it, and they come back and then you know um, merge it into the whatever is the open source or the mainstream branch over there, etc., so that it is somewhat secure. And then it also depends on how many different projects are based on it, and where is the exposure that they actually get. So there's actually a whole lot of work happening in this specific area around the world, where a lot of organizations are constantly looking at vulnerabilities in open source. There's things like on GitHub itself, dependabot, when it kind of automatically looks at what's happening within your open source code. If there is any of the vulnerability reported within your dependencies, it addresses you, and a whole lot more other advanced features as well to scan the whole code and see if there is any potential vulnerability, etc. So there's a lot of work happening over here. So I would definitely say that um, one of the advantages of open source is security.
That's actually a very counterpoint. You are saying that security is one of the main advantages of open source in some sense. You talked about Dependabot. I've seen a lot of memes around Dependabot as well, and I really love them. Okay, coming to Arvind, you were saying something, I guess, in between. I just dropped in. So yeah.
So yeah, the topic, like open source products are not secure. This has been the most standard way that people or sales folks used to counter when it comes to open source software. If you're trying to build, say, oh, that's an open source software, you should not be buying it because it's insecure. They put their code in out, like everyone knows what you're running. So there are all sorts of these. I've heard, I've seen, I have experienced it, and on one side, and then and when I was a decision maker, and then when I moved into an open source company, and then I have heard why people say this and why it is not true. In fact, actually, I had a very long discussion with a senior leader from a very big open source project, open source company, and he explained me like why like open source is so good and secure. In fact, it's completely opposite to what they were saying and how you should talk about it. So one quick thing that I would say, like open source give you a lot of eyeballs, like the software, the code, the process, everything that you do gets reviewed, or it's happening in the open. So people are more concerned, people are having more of that thought in the thing. Whereas I have seen a lot of memory leaks in popular antivirus projects, or a lot of libraries that are closed doors and shipped behind, passwords put up in the jars, and then you could decompile the jar, and like you could see the password that the standard password that is being used, or the DNS entries, anything, like I've done that, and I've been there. So it's quite thing, and this is kind of a narrative that a lot many people try to peddle, and make sure that the particular open source thing agree. But at the same point of time, I do agree to Mike. It is not completely like there are open source projects that could not be like secure, doesn't have a lot of process. That's where I think the foundations, I think recently there is a supply chain specific foundation that has been formed, like called OpenSSF or something, under Linux Foundation. And some billions of dollars are being poured into it after SolarWinds attack. I would, if people are hearing about SolarWinds, please do go and check about what SolarWinds, what is supply chain attacks and all. It's very interesting. So then you will get to know why open source, how, and everything.
Yeah,
That is really good
actually, that was
concept.
the direction I was going to go into, which is that, um, so, we have, um, I think, to recognize that some of the challenges around open source security. Um, so we have distributions of software like Red Hat and Canonical's Ubuntu, where they do a very good job of assembling and publishing a repository and signing the binaries of their packages. And there are challenges around how we get modern software. So if I pull a container binary from Docker Hub, or if I pull zip file off of GitHub and I build it, how do I know that I'm getting what the software developer intended? Um, and so this is a challenge because we have new ways that we're distributing software. And what we're seeing is a shift to cloud native technologies, especially containers as a way to ship software, that most organizations that consume software, especially, they don't want to build it from source. They want a container that a scanned container that they can trust. Linux Foundation has announced a new program around scanning containers and providing signatures and verification. And I think that while I agree transparency is good for security and hackers don't need the source code, they have plenty of tools to find memory leaks in commercial code. So they don't need the source code. It's not a big deal. They'll use the binary. Um, but there are challenges in open source, and there are challenges in key management, because once you introduce signing, who do you trust to sign the
Mhm.
packages? And so I do think that there's still challenges. There's the tools are better than ever, especially a lot of vendors, by the way, are making their tools available free to open source, which is also very wonderful thing. Um, but so it's a tough question, but I think that the open source community has work to do, and but I think that what we can build is ultimately going to be better and more scalable for the globe.
Right, definitely. And if I might add to it, most of the open source softwares right now are actually selling on the point that they're more secure, because it's a flexibility of where you can deploy, rather than like having some kind of a native product that is already out there, on a SaaS product that is already out there, that is working in a similar sense. A lot of open source projects are used by these companies, these closed source companies, as some kind of a way to actually protect their software from vulnerability as well. So there are a lot of different things that are have like being around open source, and definitely all of you have a very very similar opinion of why it's secure, and in times, like as Karan mentioned, more secure than closed source products as well. Now, since we are almost on time, I'd like to take just two more questions from the community over here, because there are so many questions, it's hard to keep a track of them. So we have a question from the earlier one, like about making money on open source. So, what is your take on this? Should a project that was free and open source and later got monetized into a business model, is it unethical to the contributors who did the contributions in the early stage of the project?
I I I want to take a stab at it, and want to tell you that this is where you are. If you There are two sides to it. First, if you are a contributor, or if you are a maintainer or creator of that project, and then that is why, from speaking from the creator point of view or the maintainer point of view, I believe that's where you are. Uh, I believe I'm not getting the right word. Like the contribution license, where you have people, before contributing, you put them through a license, and then you take their contribution and say that, you know contribute it, but I'm going to use it for whatever I want. You need to read all of that. Generally, we agree to all of that. We agree to you last. We agree to scroll down and just simply click on agree. So, but do think about it. If you have feelings about similar sort of things, you do read the agreements and like ask the maintainer. If you're a developer contributing to that project, ask the maintainer about why you have put up this. Do you have plans? Please do have that conversation and think about that. And if you are a maintainer, please do have that conversation as well with the person to do that. But that being said, like, I'm trying to refer the previous word that I have said, like, people change, and requirements change, situations change, and it's also open. A project is also like an organism, and then it grows and into a different shape that the maintainer wouldn't have like expected it to be, right? So it also so happens that people change, and then they put on to a different sort of approach. Yeah,
Right.
It-
Like
can I
now,
just add a point here?
definitely.
The
Yeah.
license might change, but you cannot unopen source something. So the developer would have the right to download the last open source version and the freedom to do whatever they want with it. That cannot be taken back. However, there's no law that says just because something was open source, a company must contribute all future enhancements. So I think it's important that to say that this isn't entirely up to the company. That the community, in fact, who had an expectation and a social contract and an actual license, they can take it from that point and they can fork it and make a new one if they want.
that's a very, very good point about forking and creating a new one. We have seen so many projects like these taking a totally new shape over there. Like one thing I wanted to ask Karan, like about thinking about a project particularly, do you think, on this question we were discussing, does the maintainers do the maintainers, or does the creator of the project has like the main power in terms of the that particular project? Because mostly those are the people who take it forward in terms of make monetizing it generally, as we have seen as well.
So it's I would say it all depends on what is the governance model that's laid out. It could be the maintainers, it could be the creators, it could be the authors of certain components, etc. A project can choose what is the governance model for it, and have they kind of donated it to a foundation, then it's something different. So it's almost very similar if you were to think about it, right? You There might be like a thought that, okay, if there is an organization, let's think about like, let's keep open source aside for a moment. They might say that, okay, the CEO has all the powers to do something, right? But actually, if you look at it, right, whenever the organization was formed, there might be certain documents, say for example, out over here there are articles of incorporation and memorandums of the board of directors, etc., which kind of clearly lay out. So it's very similar, when you look at it in, or rather, it should be in many of the open source projects, lay out a governance that, okay, this is how the project is going to move forward, and this is how there must be decisions that needs to be taken for, say, a small thing or a big feature, etc. So it all depends. Of course, maintainers do have certain kind of what do you say in some of the decisions, but maintainer is a seat. You know, one who is a maintainer who was something, a contributor before and a maintainer now later on could step back as well, right? So it all depends on the governance model that the project
Yeah.
defines.
Right, definitely the governance model. And again, it's owned by the community. They can do whatever they want in the future as well. As Mike mentioned, maybe forking it and making it something totally different from what the exact maintainer wanted it to be. Okay, so one quick question. I'm just directing it to all of you. Could open source be a big part of education, as one of the members asked over here, as corporations, or as a cooperation with universities or schools, because we do not see it generally there at the moment?
Yeah, okay. So I'll go first. So basically, I believe that open source adds a lot of value to a student. If you are talking about like anybody, like even to me, if I think as a student, like I would learn a lot by looking at a code or an algorithm that is available already on any platform in open. So I would feel like it would definitely benefit. In fact, actually, if you see a lot of FOSS models, like you say, free and open source software, I recently wrote about it, I think somewhere on Twitter or somewhere. Like free is emphasized more and open source is emphasized more, but then it also adds a lot of learning and collaboration. Like learning is a very key part, and then you learn more about it, a code, you compile it, you get to know more about things. So learning and collaboration are things that are missing in that acronym, but then they are always there, and that drives the open source community.
Let's
Awesome.
probably add that, in there, Arvind, and call it as just floss, free learning with open source or something like that. I'm just making that up. I don't know whether that's there out over there. But definitely, yes, it forms a really big part, and it's going to be really helpful. And there are a whole lot of programs out over there that various projects as well as organizations are running. Someone mentioned about Google Summer of Code, and then there is, I think, something by Force Asia, and then similarly there is something that GitHub also runs called GitHub Externship. So a whole lot of opportunities for students to actually um, contribute to open source, along with a whole lot of things, like one, Arvind mentioned, there is learning with code, there is learning with people, there is learning about the technology, and also there are prospects for actually working at an organization, because the more you're working, people really ask you for your GitHub profiles and your contributions these days to know about your extent of work. There is also a whole lot of support that's provided. Many open source projects, or even products, have student versions that are given away for free. There are things like the GitHub student pack that's also there for getting access to a lot of tools. So there's a whole ecosystem itself to actually help students to get into it. And all you have to do is just dive in, and then just explore everything that's out over there.
Definitely.
It's a
Yeah,
big
Mike.
topic. Like we could probably talk an hour about this one. I would just add that I think we should teach more kids more programming. I think that if I had a semester of Python in high school instead of a semester of trigonometry, I think it would have been better.
Definitely, actually, I agree to it. If I could have learned open source and the word about different things earlier, it would have been much better. Generally, if I should think, I learned about it in college, and that was a kickstart for me as well. Personally thinking, and we got a lot of different opinions over here, and I just love that particular acronym, current floss. We should every day do some kind of a floss, and FLCOOS, FL that Arvind added over there as well. And that particular note actually summarizes the whole thing, because we talked about very different kind of opinions around open source, which we all disagreed upon at the end, all those opinions. And if I see, the community generally disagreed on almost all of them. Like 80% was like the ratio for all of them, one was 90% even. So community is also inclined towards those aspects as well. And we can see the power of open source, what we have seen right now. I'm not trying to make a conclusion, because I said I'll have an open mind at the start of this debate, and there were different opinions that have floated around, and those were very, like, specific opinions about specific parts of open source. It's if I talk about all the statements being like secure, the one is written right now, or the previous one, creating alternatives, making money, about junior developers, everything needs some kind of a governance, as that was mentioned very initially in the debate as well by Mike, and then repeated by Arvind and Karan multiple times. As I've seen, everything has to be sustainable, and everything has a way of moving forward. So that is kind of a just what I could get. I could not make any kind of a conclusion. but I can definitely see the community being so responsive that I had never thought about. And to just give some people some kind of a swag is very difficult. But anyway, the questions I took, I am just going to announce those names. And like there were so many questions, I'll say if I had more slots, I would definitely give it out as well. So the first one is PA. He had different opinions, and I just loved them. And Derek Small, Abel Matthew, Coleman Corrigan, sorry if I am pronouncing your name incorrectly, and Shio Saitek. Again, the same thing. If I'm pronouncing your names incorrectly, sorry for that. But we would love to offer you some kind of a swag from our side, and we'll reach out to you for that for sure. So, with that, we'll end today's session. Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining. Thanks a lot, our speakers, to join as well. I'll quickly introduce the next session, and that is very interesting around the customer support part. And if you know, all three major social medias just got into the dark last month. Actually, this month only. It was pretty near, and this happened this week, this month. So around customer support, everything revolves around Facebook. Everything revolves around a central part of it, and if it goes down, it will be a nightmare. It will be a total dark for the whole world. It was, and we'll be discussing on how to prepare your customer service for that kind of an outage. It's more inclined towards a lot of customer service folks over there. So with that, this session comes to an end. Make sure you register for the next one that is happening just 1 month later on 24th of November. And see you all later once again at maybe a second iteration of the Great Open Source Debate. It's up to you. Let us know. Let us know in the open channel, in the forums, and we'll see you there. Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining in. Bye.
You. Bye.
Thank you.